So before the panel starts, I was asked to come up and talk about why this panel and why this day. I'll say it's a bit reductive, but today is more of a heady intellectual day, whereas tomorrow is going to be more visceral. At the ranch, the program is mostly inspired by the leisure and lifestyle and radical self-care chapters in Black food. And much of today's programming was actually created through the lens of me now being a publisher, because I do want to offer insight into how the publishing world operates and what authors are thinking about and how they work. And this panel is about storytelling, because we know that oftentimes the way that one can resonate, have their message resonate with an audience is by like deep and thoughtful and just brilliant storytelling. And I know that all these people have a lot of insight because they're all brilliant griots and storytellers and people who are committed to both the written and the spoken word. So just wanted to give a little context, and I will hand it over to Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson.
Thank you, Bryant, and to all of the organizers and conveners of today. So this, in the spirit of Ashara, right? I want to make sure I had your name correct. In the spirit of Ashara, I'd like for you all to imagine and be creative and think that this is our porch, right? And we're going to talk today about storytelling, and we're going to tell some stories. But you know, growing up in Virginia and throughout the summers, my family would take us, growing up in Buffalo, my family would take us back to Virginia every summer. And our house had a small porch with a swinging chair, you know, rural South. But we also had a long stoop, right? And so we would come out in the morning, if you were the first or second person, whatever, and you would take up your space on your stoop. And then over the course of the day, you know, other cousins and friends and anybody who was coming down the street would, you know, stop by or what have you. And I grew up with an uncle who was a little person. And that's significant because he was in an accident that stunted his growth. And he loved to tell the story of that. He was also a number runner and a card player. And my mother was like, the one thing I wish you had learned from your uncle is how to play cards. But, you know, that was our thing, right? And he'd tell me stories, and he'd say, okay, now wait a while, as he's telling the story. In the middle of it, he'd stop and say, wait a while. And I knew he was getting ready to get to the end. But then, of course, the story went on for probably another 45 minutes to an hour. But these are the memories, right, that storytelling helped to bring up. I just wanted, before we move into our panel, I wanted to just share with you a little bit about the porch. Because when Bryant reached out to me and said, would you participate? I said, absolutely. Because when Bryant asks you to participate, you say absolutely. And then I said, I would love for us to have a porch, right, in order to talk about storytelling, yeah? And so I just wanted to, in the words of my colleague Trudy Harris, who is a literary historian, who talks about porch sitting as a Southern cultural tradition. And we know lots of communities have porch sitting as that tradition. But she's very specific about the physical location of the porch being on that first level, right, of the house. Not to be confused with the deck, which came much later around issues of privacy and so forth. But she said that she's talking about, in her work, the first 5 to 6 decades of the 20th century. So just coming out of enslavement, out of Reconstruction, why was the porch so important, right? And she said it's where stories were told, tales were embellished, recipes were shared, cards, well, she didn't say this part, but I am. Cards were slapped on the table, checkers would jump, marbles and jacks were skipped. But you talked about everything, right? The weather, the dozens were played. Those of you who know Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, you know the porch and storytelling factored very heavily in that work. And one of the stories that that Zora Neale Hurston tells is the story of the relationship between not only Janie, the main character, and her husband, Joe Starks, who did not want her hanging out on the porch, right, with the porch talkers and the porch gossipers, because he felt like that was beneath her, that was trashy talk. But it was there that Janie sort of read him, right, because he tried to embarrass her in front of everybody else on the porch and tried to call her old, and so she came back. And so one of the things that Zora Neale Hurston reminds us is that when you're putting your foot up on somebody, especially when you're out in public and on the porch, be prepared for the consequences, right? And so that's part of that porch talk that we may talk about a little bit today. But the other thing about that story, Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God, that I love is the relationship between Janie and her friend Phoebe, her girlfriend Phoebe, who Janie was really ostracized by the community, because also on the porches where people shame and criticize and ridicule. There she go, he come, right? All of that kind of stuff. Well, Phoebe, being aware that this was happening around Janie went over and talked to Jamie, and Janie ended up telling her full story, which most of us, most of the time, don't have the full story. That's why it's so easy for us to shame other people, right? So Janie tells her the story, and Phoebe has a response that I'm going to share in a minute. But before I do that, I want to tell you this really quick story about a community called Bayview in Virginia. It's about 25 miles from Virginia Beach, right? And back in '98, when I first became aware of this community, Bayview was a majority black community, all black community. It had been founded by former enslaved people in Virginia. And in 1998, this community of people were living with no water, no electricity, in abject squalor. The state of Virginia decided this was a perfect location to put a maximum security prison. Alice Coles, who was a single mother of 2 at the time, got together with several other folks along with the Audubon Society, and they basically stopped the state of Virginia from taking that land to build a maximum security prison, because they said they didn't want their children within eyesight of that school-to-prison pipeline that was being established by the state of Virginia. Well, after that, they said, if we can stop them from building a prison, then we can stop ourselves from living this way, right? And so these women primarily came together, and along with the help of politicians, some NAACP and some others, they decided to build units, housing units in the community. In 2003, Mr. Bradley did a 60-minute documentary on this. So if you want to Google it, go to YouTube and look up Bayview, Virginia. But essentially, they built these homes that for some people in 1998 and then in the 2000s had no idea you could control lights or your electricity or anything else with a switch on the wall. In 1998, right? But here's what's most important for me that's relative to today, today's conversation. Alice Coles in the community asked the USDA, who was partly funding this through a public housing grant, they asked them to build porches. And the USDA, because it's a government entity, said you have to justify that because we're not going to build on a porch. And so here's what Alice Coles said, and I'm paraphrasing because it's not a direct quote, but she talked about family life. And she did say, if you take the porch, it's like taking the farm. You take our past, our stories, our songs, our poems, our scriptures. The porch is where our village is created and maintained. And so, like Alice Coles and the arguments that she said, we're going to talk a little bit about our own stories, what it means to be a storyteller, how we do this work. We're going to talk about how it manifests in Black food. And I hope that after you hear each of our, what Patricia Bell Scott calls Flat-Footed Truths, or the bare truth. I hope that after you hear our stories, you will be able to say, like Phoebe said to Janie in Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God. She said, I done grow 10 feet tall listening to you, Janie. I ain't satisfied with myself no more. I hope that when you leave here after hearing our panel, you will also say you're not satisfied with yourself no more unless you tell and listen to other people's stories. What stories do you all have to tell? Sarah, Osayi, and Marvin, who, I'm sorry, Marvin, right?
Yeah, that's me.
Because we all just met like 10 minutes ago. But what stories do you all have to tell?
Well, what I'd like to start with is the story that's in Black food, because it's a blessing, and it's an origin story. And as a gastro-theologian, I read the Bible by the food that's prepared in the Bible. And that's an amazing way to understand, how food has worked throughout that tradition. On the first day, God made a meal plan, finally had it all figured out, finally had a taste for something. On the second day, God made a grocery list, one of everything, God thought. On the third day, God planted a garden so God could go to a farmer's market. On the fourth day, God sharpened God's knives. God created iron and cast it into skillets. God preheated the oven and forgot about it. We will talk about this hell another time. On the fifth day, God chopped and God baked and God boiled and God braised and God boiled and God fried and God grilled and God roasted and God poached and God steamed and God stewed. For hours, God stewed. On the sixth day, God opened all the pots, and a mist went up from the pots and watered the whole face of God. And God sweat the vegetables. And God created company, and they came over and they ate with God. And God looked around God's kitchen and ended their work which they had done, and they rested. On the eighth day, itis. This is the history of cooking by sight and by smell. This is the history of the heavens and the earth when soul food was created, before any Tupperware, before any tinfoil, before anybody saw or say how they could have made it better. God created satisfaction. Let us pray for first and last suppers, and knowing that we can trace our divinity by the meals that were served in our sacred text. Yes, for this new theology of gastronomy, thank you. This prayer over everything and everyone, this blessing over everything and everyone, this libation poured over everything and everyone, and this knowing that everyone gets fed. Thank you, my true vine. Remind us that you're in this slime with us all. There's an okra part in this with all the African names and all the diasporic names for okra that I cannot do right now. But it's in the book, so please read it. Thank you for this spread and for this stretching our love budget enough to send a plate to our neighbors and for making our eyes bigger than our stomachs. Rise and flower, Hercules Posey. Rise and flower, James Hemings. Rise and flower, Edna Lewis. Rise and flower, Lena Richard. Rise and flower, Lucille Elizabeth Bishop Smith. Rise and flower.
Sarah?
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's here. It's a real honor for me to be on this panel. Bryant, look at what you have created. This is so spectacular. And I want to thank all the MOAD staff, Elizabeth, and everyone who just does magic in this place for us. I have so many thoughts as we have been blessed to hear so many people speak today, and I'm a writer, and so storytelling is very close to my heart. I would be remiss, I think, to start talking about storytelling and my own storytelling without mentioning someone who's just right in my eye line here. This is Professor Faith Adiele, who runs the African Book Club here, and I just wanted to highlight that because that's all about storytelling, and there's now a prize, and the winner was announced recently. So those of you who are not aware of that, check that out. I should say I was a former board member at MOAD, so I have my eyes on all the great things that are going on. But back to storytelling, I love the way that Ashara started and mentioned the importance of looking back and the whole concept of Sankofa as well, looking forward, looking back, honoring those who've come before us. I think about that a lot, and I'm going to read a piece that I have in this wonderful book, Black Food, which is looking back and an honoring of sorts for Toni Morrison, who's been a great inspiration to me. So Toni Morrison passed almost exactly 3 years ago now. But before I want to look back, I do want to highlight someone else in the audience here today who is an immense inspiration to me. I have a book coming out entitled Between Starshine and Clay, Conversations from the African Diaspora, which includes some conversations I've done with MOAD. The starshine of that book is with us today, and her name is Mrs. Willard Harris. Mrs. Willard Harris is 102 3/4. She says 102 1/2, but it's really 3/4. And I want to highlight her. She was one of the first Black heads of nurses. One of California's, maybe the first Black head of nurses in California. And I was thinking about her as you were talking about the stoop and the porch. I'm lucky enough to be Mrs. Harris's neighbor. And for the last year, we have gone walking each week. And we sit at the end of our 40-minute walk. We sit on her stoop and we talk and we share stories. And I often feel that we just don't celebrate enough those in our midst with us right now. So thank you for cheering for her, and I want to celebrate each of you as well. So I'm going to quickly, as a storyteller, I can go on and on and on and on, so I better turn that off. But I want to share with you a curtailed section of this piece that I wrote entitled Jolloffing with Toni Morrison. And I love the way that Dr. Gail Myers read to us her piece on rice, which ended on "We are rice." And in this form of call and response, Jollof is all about rice. So we're already calling and responding to each other. Jollof, as a noun, is a West African one-pot dish made with onions, peppers, tomatoes, tomato paste, palm oil, vegetable stock, rice, cooking oil, salt, tastiest when cooked over firewood. As a verb in Nigerian Pidgin, it means to party, make merry, live it up, enjoy, tell stories, celebrate good times. And I start the piece, which I'll curtail a little bit, with a mention of September the 6th, 2019, when I was giving a talk in South Africa, and someone came up to me and said, "What did Toni Morrison's house smell like?" I had the great privilege of spending an afternoon with Toni Morrison in her home in April of 2017 in Grandview-on-Hudson, Rockland County, New York. So when I was asked that question, my mind went back to that afternoon. Nadine, Toni Morrison's housekeeper, opens the door and lets us in. Morrison is not yet ready to receive us, so we wait upstairs in the living room where Morrison has said, "Make yourselves at home." Nadine is in the kitchen chopping vegetables. Soon there's a loud sizzle, and I catch the sharp bite of onion and peppers, turning sweet as they fry. I can smell tomatoes in there too. It smells like home, like jollof. Back in Nigeria, we used to eat jollof on Sundays after church services and when celebrating Eid with friends at the end of Ramadan. The best part, if you could get to it, were the crackly bits of rice stuck at the bottom of the pan. Jollof is both everyday and party food, but no celebration is complete without it. And when served with fresh plantains, it's heaven, or rather fried plantains. Fish, says Nadine, when I walk over to ask what she's preparing. Something healthy for Mrs. Morrison, she adds, her words lightly seasoned with the flavor of Jamaica. The aroma has me thinking about the one-pot dishes Morrison writes about in her works, a pot of turnips or moors, often simple, meager meals to stave off hunger or to soothe. And fish, I remember the crisp sea bass with the tiny flakes of white in Miss Marie's daydreaming of a meal shared with a past love. I remember the precious piece of eel that ferryman Stamp paid feed Setha in her escape from slavery. And what jollofing on the page when Morrison uses food in the naming of her characters: plum, meringue pie, sweetness, chicken and pie, and milkman, or in describing skin tones from cream to licorice to lemonade, milk and whey. And there is something about berries, the temptation of them, as in a deep dish berry cobbler toppled by inquisitively hungry children, or those other berries that tasted like church, just one of those berries and you felt anointed, delivered to one who was so close to being free of her slave masters. And when Morrison uses food as a metaphor for sex, she's at her tantalizing best. From the sexual suggestiveness in the eating of an ear of corn, quote, how loose the silk, how fine and loose and free, to a woman's naked body, quote, moist and crumbly as unbleached sugar. Morrison's word work is sublime. Every mention of food hints at a longing that simmers just beneath the surface. Nadine cut short my reverie. Miss Morrison is now ready, and as we walk downstairs to her study, the smell of lunch accompanies us. She says to call her Tony, and in turn, she calls us her friends, which feels so warm and delicious. It's Easter Saturday, and Tony's friends and family drop by unannounced, just as I remembered it from my childhood. No invitations, but you never arrived empty-handed. We would take cakes, fruits, or vegetables when visiting. What did you bring me? Tony teases her son, Ford, who is the first to arrive. A sandwich? She asks. Not a sandwich, he says, but books, something to satisfy a different hunger. Tony's neighbor, Ned, is the next to arrive, bearing an eye-popping floral arrangement as large as his hug. After an exchange of pleasantries, Tony asks Ned if he might bring her some food from his brother's restaurant. Seafood? You want seafood with pasta? Ned is happy to oblige. Yes, says Tony. Okay, some pasta, some seafood? Yes, 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 Tony enthuses. And a little dessert? Yes. Just for one, you're not having a dinner party, are you? Ned checks. And here is where I join in, playfully suggesting that we stay for dinner. I tell her I'd planned on bringing a chocolate cake. Hey, says Tony, with excitement at the mention of cake. What did you do? She adds, feigning indignation when I confess to only having bought chocolates. August 6, 2019, Peckham, London. On the day Toni Morrison dies, I am in London. When I hear the news, I immediately set out on a walk, looking for a quiet place to process the shock. I find a church and sit outside on an empty bench. At the foot of the bench, I see a slice of fried plantain. 2 days earlier, friends and I had shared jollof rice and plantain from a nearby Nigerian takeout called Chop. Perhaps the plantain came from there, and here it lies, like an offering, a libation for the ancestors. I closed my eyes and returned to that afternoon when we had jollofed at Tony's house, which had smelled, quite simply, of home.
So beautiful. Osayi?
Peace, y'all. I'm Osayi. I gotta say, I feel a little misled because, I'm teasing a little bit, but, when Psyche said, okay, we're gonna have a porch vibe, and I'm thinking, all right, it's gonna be like, something brown, and, we're gonna have I love it, but I kind of felt like all right, I came to kind of talk shit a little bit, so we gonna do this. So I'm gonna bring that element to the party. We've had our decorum, and now we're gonna get a little. It's been a summer. It's been a time, and I feel like I didn't really come in the mood to read something to y'all, but I feel like I'm a storyteller, so I ought to be able to tell you a story. So
We don't have anything brown, but this is the base, so we can put some in the air.
I know. No, I'm good. But for real, I've been traveling a lot, and over the past few weeks, just felt like I was getting hit with a lot of unexpected turbulence. And for those of us who didn't necessarily grow up with for the literal porch, we have our symbolic porches, right? And for me, those places are often in restaurants, in bars, in places where I get to explore what I do for a living, which is think about how our food culture and our identity intersect and what that says about who we are. But my favorite proverbial porch is probably going home. And I've been sitting here kind of glassy-eyed as Marvin and Sarah were reading and Psyche was speaking, because I feel like very present to the women in my family who have been that symbolic porch for me, and who continue to be. So when I was feeling waylaid, I just went home, And I'm from California. I'm crying, but don't worry, okay? I'm fine. And I got to LA. My family is mostly in the Southern California area. And when that happens, it's wonderful, because I hear from all my friends and all my people in an area where I spent most of my youth. But I couldn't go anywhere, because I was just done up. I just had to lay down. And I realized something, that I'm at an age now where I can no longer feel the need to conceal that I smoke weed in front of my relatives. And so the joy of being able to openly start your morning on your mother's patio with a joint is a level of freedom I did not know that I needed at that time. And it also showed me that I have a level of transparency about what I've been dealing with. I've been dealing with, breakups and biopsies and burglaries and just busted AC units and all kinds of things. Life be lifing. Yeah, life be lifing. And as all these areas of my life were unstable, thank you. You were mean to me earlier. Now you feel bad. No. The porch. He started talking shit when I was out here. I just met you. It's fun. But yeah, so I say all that to say, I guess I was just kind of trying to figure out, when those kinds of things happen, it's a disruption, because you realize, you're not in the part of the story that you thought you were. And then, so the first part is like the shock, like, how disrespectful. And then the other part of it is like, well, what do I do now, right? And I realized that I didn't know what to do, so I just had to lay down, I had to rest, and I had to talk transparently to the folks around me, which is not something I'm always good at because, independent and strong and not wanting to bother people, but it doesn't work that way because then when you get broken down, nobody understands that you've been dealing with things, right? It's been a huge lesson for me the last couple of years. And so, like, I started, realizing what some of the things I needed to do energetically was deal with some digital purging. This is kind of a leap from where I'm talking about, but it's all connected, right? These relationships are real. I started realizing I had a lot of text message threads with dead people, or like I was following dead people. I realized that I just had a lot of loose ends that I didn't realize were hanging out. And it had been exhausting. And I didn't know until, you don't know what you don't know. But at the same time, I think sometimes those little vestiges of the past can be the markers. And I spoke to a healer recently who was encouraging me to go through some old journals that I have. And I've been mad about these old journals because when the last time I was up here, my rental car got smashed and grabbed, and I was in the parking lot of an In-N-Out in Oakland by the Oakland airport. And in the moments that I thought I was just getting a cheeseburger, the very important belongings that I'd had in my carry-on were taken from the back of an SUV. And when a writer loses her devices, it's very upsetting. Like, I borrowed a friend's computer, but like it wasn't my computer. Like it didn't function the same. I didn't have the shortcuts. I didn't have my things. So I felt like I couldn't work. My journal was in that bag, a necklace that my grandmother had gifted me many years ago that I just didn't wear that day. For some reason, I just put it in the bag. And so it's gone. And I had to deal with it like it was temporary anyway, right? And that like the words in those journals and the content on those devices, which ended up in China within a week, by the way, I had them already. And so like, this constant push, it seemed, over the last few weeks to just be pushing me to let go and let go and let go. And so when you're like walking around feeling really unstable, but then you're realizing that all your needs are being met, and you have people in your life who love you, and you're laughing, and there's a perception that you're living this dream life, you really got to get clear about what you care about, And so I was purging my phone. I realized I had all these voicemails. And I had taken my grandmother's name out of my phone, but I didn't realize I had some of her voicemails saved. And I don't even know what, she's just talking, because she used to talk a lot of shit too, but let's just see what she's talking about here.
Hi, Osayi, it's Grandma. I'm glued to the television, MSNBC, regarding Dallas. So, you called me. Remember, I go to breakfast from 8 to 9:30. I go to lunch from 12 to 1:30, and dinner from 5 to 6:30. And then I go to exercise from 10:30 to 11. So give me a buzz when you have a chance, okay? Thinking about you all the time. Love you. Bye-bye.
Come on now.
So that's my grandma. That's Ruth Russian. I think there was a shooting in Dallas. That was 2016, I think. She was always quick to want to report on the news and what was happening, lest she be left behind. She died at 92 in, I guess maybe 2018. She is the mother to the aunt that I write about briefly in my essay in Black Food, Patrice Rushen, who's my mom's big sister, Angela. And I think those are the people who I was hanging out with and being, tended to when I was down last month. And I kept scrolling and I said, oh, here, look, here's another one. This is Auntie Babe. I didn't know that Babe was not her name until I was probably like 13. Her name is Luella. This is my grandfather's baby sister.
Hi, Osayi. I was having trouble with my cell phone for some reason. I don't use it enough to know how to use it. And so I'm calling you from my house phone now. And I just want to thank you for calling me, wishing me happy birthday. Thank you. I hope I'll be able to get you at some other time later during I guess during this day or another day. Okay. Thanks for calling. It's Babe.
It's Babe.
Bye.
Babe doesn't have a cell phone anymore because she's getting in trouble with the cell phone. So she only ever calls from the house phone now. I also realized that there are the women in my life who I don't see and I don't talk to very much, but they are my father's sisters who live in Nigeria. I didn't know them growing up. They knew me, but I didn't really know them, and that's owing to my dad being the complex figure that he was. But there was a period of time when they were leaving me a lot of voicemails in the aftermath of his death, me being the eldest child, and tasked with getting him buried in Benin City, which was waylaid by the Oba of Benin dying, and you could not bury people or have weddings until the new Oba is coronated, which was very much unbeknownst to me. And so it took months to get it all sorted, and I think about them a lot. I feel like I don't really show up for them in the way that I probably should or could, but they're there, and very much part of who I am, part of that strength.
How are you? I hope you are fine. I just want to remind you that a month from today is when your father's burial is supposed to start. The earlier you start preparing, my dear, the better. God bless you. Have a blessed day.
So Auntie Helen said, get your shit together because we were all waiting on you. So I've just been like kind of tending to myself and reassessing what it means to be in a good place. So, an editor who I'd been very late with recently said, "Oh, I'm glad you're okay." And I said, "No, you said that." I turned in the copy. I didn't say I was okay. And like to be okay with like not being okay sometimes. And that, Psyche, I reread your essay in this book, Black Food, and, you talk about the nurturing that may or may not have come through the food, particularly for young girls ripped away from their parents and then forced to work and to be parents. How do you nurture someone who comes from an experience that is so traumatizing, right? It's very much part of who we are, and I think about like the nurturing of our ancestral selves, our younger selves, our current selves, our professional selves, and I'm like increasingly less and less interested in drawing lines between those versions of me because it's not helping. And it's also like kind of robbing us of the real story, So that's what I'm thinking about on the porch today. Yeah.
Because we all have stories, right? And you weren't misled. You knew the assignment, and you did it very well. And all morning we've been hearing about stories and storytelling. And of course, this afternoon, you're going to hear a little bit more about how you package those stories, right? But, one of the things I think is important for us to remember, and then we want to open it up for comments and questions from you all, but I think it's important as Black people that we listen to all the stories we've heard this morning from beginning to end. It's really, really important that we not get caught up in a single story, as Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie talks about, right? In her TED Talk, The Danger of the Single Story. If you don't know it, it's a quick 10-minute YouTube. And she says, it's not that the story is not true, it's that the story is incomplete. And so when we fall prey to listening to the single story, we forget the richness that you just heard here, both extemporaneously, that which has been prepared, that which has been written, that which has been sung about, that which has been libated. We forget the richness that comes out of Black culture and the ways in which we can tell a story in a second. Or I love what, what's the comedian who passed away from sarcoidosis? Bernie Mac, what he says, when I teach the story of the word motherfucker, because he says it's a person, place, or thing. And he tells this story in like 5 minutes and then drops the mic and walks off. And I'm like, yes, that's what I'm talking about right there, right? How you can weave a story out of your life, how you weave a story out of your day, how you weave a story out of a moment, right? And that's what I think Porch Talk is all about in some ways, is how we just sit in stillness, in the comfortable of the silence, and tell a story in our silence. You don't always need to respond, because you can answer in silence, right? And so I think this is kind of what we did here today. We shared with you a little bit of how we think in, as Zora Neale Hurston said, Black folks think in hieroglyphics. We think in pictures, and we tell stories based on those pictures that are in our mind, of the experiences we had, of the memories that are wrought, of the plantain on the bench, of the smell of peppers and tomatoes and onions, and of slime, as the world was created. And that's the way we tell stories. How you package them is very different. They could be oral, they could be written, they could be danced. They could be in your clothing, right? Wearable art. They could be, you tell that story on our Black bodies. We tell stories every day, all day. And we are walking, living architects of history, of present, of future. And when we allow people to deny us that wholesomeness and that liberation, then we're allowing ourselves to be without our stories.
Can I
Jump
just
in.
add? I just want to.
You're supposed to jump in and take it over.
I just wanted to say one of the things, Osayi, that I really loved about what you shared with us is that we were transported across the nation. We were transported around the globe with the sounds, with the voices that you shared with us. And it's also an illustration. I mean, you mentioned hieroglyphics, and then here we have technology. Here we have the phone. And so across generations, and I love the way that you were able to bring that, and I love the way that the panel, we've got the whole notion of the diaspora. We hear from West Africa, you hear the British accent, which will never go away, and different accents from this nation as well. So thank you.
You also make me think, we have technology and we have hieroglyphics, but we also have the cloud, and I think we should never fear losing our story, because Black people store cultural production in this thing called the cloud that white people don't have access to. And I feel like a lot of of what our work is to try to remember the passcode. You know, and as storytellers, I feel like each story we write is another turn of the lock and the combination to access thousands of years of Black folks placing stories in the cloud who knew that they couldn't tell them in their time. You know, but they don't disappear. They are stored. And as storytellers, I think it's our work to try to get access to them. You know, and we try, and we try, and we try. And then we have books, and we have stories, all towards trying to get to those.
And we have to keep telling them, right?
Yeah.
In the different ways, through our music, through our food, right? I think we have to keep telling those stories because there's a whole generation of folks who think that they invented storytelling last week on social media. And so we have to remind them that it's a cipher and the chain remain the same, right? And the
That
story
was a
you're
front
telling-
porch read, by the way. Let's be clear what's happening here.
Well, I have to tell my daughter that all the time. Right? I'm like, hey, no, you know, like, girl, please. So, I mean, you know, like, I forgot about things you haven't even begun to think about, okay? And so, you know, but that's why we have these stories. That's why we need things like this summit and this book, because we're going to have to share these stories with generations to come. You know, this past week, Nikki Giovanni, the poet, retired from Virginia Tech after 37 years, I think. And I thought about the numerous people whose lives she's influenced and touched just in everyday conversation, certainly through her work, and how this is one more pillar in Black knowledge production from a generation of scholars like Morrison and so many others who is seeing a different era of her life. And I mourned for a moment because I said, I hope she doesn't leave Earth too soon before so many more people are blessed by her words and her performance. Because when this generation is gone, they're gone. You know, and those stories that are gone with them are stories that we cannot afford to lose. So while we spend a lot of time talking about Southern food, culture, and that's wonderful, I'm happy about that in Black Food Studies, we have got to move on because we have so many different stories that we have to tell and so little time as generations of people move forward. So I'm thankful, Brian, for this book that you've captured here. What about you all? What stories and ways of storytelling excite you? We have probably time for a couple of comments. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hello, thank you so much. I've been working in the Black community. I'm a native San Francisco living in the Fillmore for over 10 years, grassroots work. It started with fair housing, which because of my mental health, I could no longer do that. And I moved into Black food sovereignty, and I've been working in the community with that. When I read on the agenda that there were going to be stories, it triggered me. The stories that I hear are usually at meetings that we're trying to accomplish something. And what happens is we hear story after story after story. Recently, there was a meeting the other night that someone invited. It was supposed to be a working meeting. I'm really pragmatic. I got a certain amount of time, so many meetings. And it was supposed to be a working meeting. Somebody got on and told a story about housing. We were talking about housing. And I got frustrated. I got frustrated because it just triggers me. I've heard it. Come on, let's move forward. And so I guess my comment is, even with me seeing storytelling, I said, oh, maybe I should take a break during this time. And the reason why is I always cry. I'm an empath. It re-triggers everything. It re-triggers all kinds of stuff. And then I can't focus on whatever the city said that we need to do a report about whatever. So I guess my comment, and I would love your opinions on it, is in the Black community, we have so much trauma, and storytelling is healing how can we put it in the area so that's all it is, as opposed to it bleeds into everything? And I've always said, for us to get reparations, for us to get fairness, we have to heal each other, and we have to love each other first before we can make any advances. So I guess my question is, because it creeps into everything, storytelling and the trauma, and then I cry, and then I have a therapist session the next day, and then I'm not ready to write the report of whatever needs to be done. So I guess the comments I'd like to hear is there a way we can invent something that we get that all out in one area so that we can start healing and moving forward with some stuff to demand from the city or the government or whatever it is we're trying to stop, and change those stories as we move forward. So first of all, thank you. I did enjoy. I wasn't triggered. It was very enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
When I went to Nigeria for the first time as an adult to bury my father, there were all these rites of passage that I had to participate in that no one had really fully explained all of the things. So I was just constantly like surprised. And also like not really clear on what to do, because my father just wasn't one of those immigrants who kept that flow of information steady. It was always like, how do you not know these things? And it's like, who is going to teach me if you didn't teach me? So it was interesting to be around his relatives and them come face to face, like right with those decisions. And in so doing, I had to relinquish some expectations around what process and propriety and like, you know, efficiency meant. And you know, for my father's eldest brother, Victor, respect and you know, gestures of you know, appreciation went a lot further than having all my paperwork in order from the morgue, right? Like those kinds of things. And it was humbling to be in a place where I was supposedly like the decision maker as the eldest, but also like as a woman, like not really at all. Also like to be the American, like that being a privilege, but also like sort of like disdained, you know. And really what I took away from that was like the things that I had found like kind of really frustrating about the way my dad would do things sometimes growing up was like, this is not actually just him. Like it's like really part of the fabric of this culture. And you know, it's always going to be very, I think, impossible to fix a problem that is like foreign. Like it's like a tumor. Like right, it's like an abnormality. By almost like trying to, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that maybe the storytelling is the point. Like the process is the thing that is being placed on an abnormality. Like, but the storytelling is the origin. Mm-hmm. That is the source. The process is fixing a problem that has invaded the origin. Okay. So the reports and the budgets and even the concept of time is an infringement on who we are. That is the trauma. So it's never going to get fixed that way. It is the world we're living in. It is the container in which we are all trying to survive. But it's not like the thing. We're the thing. So start there and just see, because the stories are how we remind ourselves who we are, where we come from, what we've lost, what's been taken from us. And even in the joy, right, of like I went to St. Lucia recently. I did this cover story for Travel and Leisure. It's actually on stands right now. I had a great time, but I was also in this constant dynamic, this very strange dynamic of, I was walking down this farm on a resort property with a man who looks like me, and he said, "I've never been interviewed by anyone like you." And then even in the editing of that story, I'm having to excise all this colonial language that gets put in by an editing team that read the piece and loved it, but still is framing it in a very colonial way. The container is rotten. So I don't know. I just know that we gotta meditate, we gotta drink water, we gotta have a lot of sex. We gotta be outside. I don't know.
But every time we tell the story, isn't that's part of the healing, right? That's part of the transformation.
Yeah. And I think your resistance to it is because it's awful to have to hear the same story over and over again.
But also in the hearing it, in the being told, as you're hearing it and hearing it and hearing it, somebody may be healing by continuing to say it.
Yeah.
That is their therapy, because they don't have a therapist. And so while, I think healing is messy, right? It's messy. So what's healing for you can be triggering for me, but how do we coexist in the trigger healing exchange, right? But I have to tell this story. And I'm saying this because I live with another human being who has many life challenges. And sometimes I got to hear the same story over and over and over again as she's working through her childhood traumas, which predated her coming into my life, right? And so I'm hearing them, and sometimes I'm like, and sometimes I'm like, okay. And sometimes I'm just quiet, because I realize her telling is her healing, even though it's triggering for me. I'm like, where is the next buzz? Where? Because I have heard this story, Lord have mercy, now my hand's shaking, all that. So, but I recognize that she's healing, and she has to go where I am, though her journey is going to be different. And I pray that she has a journey past a certain age, right? So I have to let her heal in the retelling and telling of that story. We have a question here, and I think there's another. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. That was really beautiful. A really powerful panel. I want to thank Sarah for calling out African Book Club and invite all of you to join us. And I want to say, Osayi, I really relate to your journey. I also was the eldest and had to go back to Nigeria to bury my father with no roadmap. But
solidarity.
Right? The struggle is real. And at the end of the trip, actually, my family tried to get me to bring back the head of a cow that had been sacrificed, and they didn't quite understand that it was not going to work as my carry-on. They're like, we'll just wrap it up. So I hopped in the taxi and sped out. But I'm actually covering the summit for Detour magazine, which is doing Black travel. It's a vertical that's focusing on Black travel and kind of both local and international, and kind of decolonizing the language we use around it and showing how Black folks are the most traveled and visited folks, and everything we do is about travel. And so I'm really interested in kind of the intersections of food and travel, and metaphorically, how we travel from the porch, how so many of us have global connections. And I was just wondering if anyone would like to kind of address how travel is at the root of how you think about food, too. Thank
you. Yeah, I think, Faith, to your question, part of why I wrote what I wrote was, again, this intersection between food and travel, and how, for me, as someone who grew up in Nigeria, lived in Kenya, then Europe, and Toni Morrison traveled with me. And so just sort of thinking about that travel, being back in Southern Africa, and just all the, being in Southern Africa and then in America and England, and there's a richness. There's both, just sort of contemplating on how fragile our roots are and moving, and both of you have had experiences of going back to Nigeria and being thrown into situations where you don't have the roadmap, and yet you've done it somehow, and how, I guess I'm just sort of musing on what you said about food and travel, both the fragility of sort of roots and maybe not being as rooted as we would like to be, and yet having stories that we can take with us, that are a sense of strength.
And I think to add to that, I just did a piece for the Oxford American last spring that was edited by Carolyn Randolph, right? About Black people and movement. Because, since we've been brought to this country, we've always moved. We are, as you said, some of the original travelers. And so I was talking a lot about surveillance. So talk about storytelling and healing. This is a set of stories that I've had to tell because our lack of the freedom to move about the country or any space. There's that American Express commercial where the white man comes down the stairs and throws a dart over his shoulder, and wherever it lands, he's able to move. And I'm like, talk about colonial privilege. It's a fascinating example. Of course, coming through American Express is even more fascinating. But, but I talk about how our bodies, minds, and souls are under constant surveillance. And how people say to me, oh, it's going to be wonderful. It'll be a beautiful trip. And I'm always thinking 10 steps up the road. Where can we eat? Where can we go to the restroom? Where can we rest? Where can we do thus and so without reprisal or fear that I could lose my job if I say a thing, or I could go to jail if I'm not careful, or I could lose my life if so telling that story was cathartic for me, because I'm like, we got to just come on out and say it. Bell Hooks talks about it, being at a conference and hearing liberal speakers speak, and she's like, if you all are the liberal ones, I'm in trouble, right? And so, but just feeling that sense of being in the moment, but always having to think ahead of the moment and back from the moment, right? Just always in the space of liminality, which is what the porch is, right? It's the liminal space between the inside and the outside of the house. So I can run what's going on inside the house from the porch, because I can yell and be like, do this, do that, turn that beans off, do this, that. But while I'm sitting out here, I'm constantly watching and looking, because I have to be ever vigilant of who's coming down my road, who's coming by my street, who's looking for so-and-so. No, I don't know them. And so-and-so, and so it's always this space of belonging, becoming, and moving. And it's tiring and exhausting. And so I appreciate your critical self-care, even when we don't realize we need it. And I think that's part of our story, is to continuously say, no. Maybe one more question? Okay, I hope you have one? Okay.
I wanted to ask a little bit about editing, because so much of great storytelling is about self-editing. And I'm just curious to know how each of y'all approaches that when you're writing, and what you decide to keep in and what do you decide to take out in order to keep the story going, in order to keep the momentum and keep people's interest who are going to be reading it.
How y'all do it?
That's a subject for a whole other panel. It's huge.
That's the publishing, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, it's a risk, right? It's very risky business. Sometimes I'm like, why did I choose this life? it's just, I think you have to, for me, I have to convince myself of this every time, every assignment. Like, you can't rework a blank page. It's like a little bit, I don't know. There's just I have to remind myself every time. Like, I'll be thinking and thinking and thinking, and I'll be like, you're thinking so much because you haven't written shit. Like, you got to go sit down and write it. Then you'll know what to think. And so, like, the editing comes from being in it. And I think when you see it, you can say, well, I don't know, maybe, or you can say, actually, I don't need to go say that at all. And I know for me, part of that liminality in the storytelling as a career has meant that it's really hard for me to, I wouldn't say hard, it's that a lot more goes into me delivering a draft than just getting it out on paper and feeling kind of good about it, because I'm having to inoculate it to my level of satisfaction against all these systemic decision-making things that I know that left unaddressed, I might end up with a piece published with my name on it that is not actually representative of what I wanted to say. And that doesn't mean that you don't have to be collaborative and understand that you're working with businesses and they all have their brand identities and their style guides and all that, but I'm talking even just like accuracy. I had a piece where I referenced my aunt's greyhounds, and without asking me at the 11th hour, someone changed it to Greyhound Bus because they just could not fathom, it made no sense to them that this black family would have greyhounds running around a property in North LA. I mean, that's how basic it is. The lack of imagination for black life and its interiorities is very dismal. So something that I would never think would be a problem was suddenly already printed and distributed to millions of households. And I'm all, so like the editing is sometimes a disruption to the storytelling because I'm not in control of how it gets to you. And that is why we have folks like Bryant trying to do what he's doing, because it's not that you're not going to still have lack of clarity, right? Like, it's not like we're all from very different experiences and cultures, but there's an empathy and an interest that is fundamental here that just isn't available in my industry. So I think the editing comes at it carries a lot of responsibility, and it's constantly balancing between like the craft and being able to be extemporaneous and be in the moment and feel whatever's channeling through you, and then having to say, okay, now how do I protect this? How do I manage this? So it's a juggle.
Yeah, I just want to build on what you're saying and give some more examples. And I think this also brings us back to Bryant Terry and For Color imprint, I think, and the importance of it. Not thinking so much about our own editing, perhaps as writers, but as you're referring to the whole structure, all of those who will come and edit. I mean, I've found this in audiobooks. When I recorded my audiobooks, I was getting feedback on pronunciation of European words, but nothing from Yoruba or Igbo or Hausa or Swahili, other languages that are in my work. So there's you can pronounce that however the heck you want to pronounce it. So that in terms of audiobooks, and then, I won't throw my publishers under the bus for the new forthcoming book, but, just having to be so vigilant, even people with the best of intentions. There's a lot of things that I was working through with the index of this forthcoming book, well, why are you putting these names in and not these names? And, so I think editing writ large that's why I think I said it's just a huge subject, not just what we do, but all of the other steps and those involved, which is why what Bryant Terry is doing is so important. And, we need to have more representation our voices need to be at every level.
At every level. Tell your story. I mean, I think that's the point. But to your point, you just reminded me, and I'll say this in closing, with the release of my current book, Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America. They translated it to audio. And the very first reader they gave me was, and the examples was someone who was very honey child. You know, hey girl. And I said, no. That's not this, that's not my work. That's not this book. And how dare you? You know, I'm like, this is it? Well, no, we have other. So how did you come to this conclusion that this should be the first reader you give me could also do a Popeyes commercial? And so, you know, and no offense, that is perhaps her style, but I'm like, but if you read it, if you read any part of my book, you would know that that's not. So tell your story and command your space. And then they sent me another, and I said, yes, this would be what I'm looking for. Is this under the table? I don't know. Something started moving under the table. I'm like, hey, what's going on? But tell your story and maintain your ground. That's part of the healing transformation work, even though it's hard and we're doing it all the time. And no, you don't understand what I'm trying to say here. Stop changing what I'm trying. Oh my God. But, you know, but tell your story. Look, I hope you all, like Phoebe, grow 10 feet tall in listening to our panel, and thank you for your comments.